Good evening, and thanks for Zooming in tonight. My name is Sarah Mills, and I am a researcher at the University of Michigan. What I want to do tonight is start by giving you an overview of what we'll be presenting and how to submit questions. I will do that, but first I want to introduce myself so that you have a bit of an understanding of where I'm coming from. So, my academic background is in rural land use planning. And as part of my research, I have investigated understanding whether wind energy is a farmland preservation tool. Through that work, it's involved surveys of over 4,000 Michiganders who live near wind farms, both in communities that are mostly predominantly farming, because as we'll see, most of the wind farms in the state are in farming communities, but also those that have a mix of land uses. A lot of my work at the university and other research is on renewable energy policy and public opinion. And right now I have funding from the State Energy Office, which is part of EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, to help facilitate planning and zoning across the state on energy issues, to provide state-based data and to present pros and cons of energy. As you'll see, my personal MO is that every energy source has its positives and negatives at the local level. And it's really important that communities understand that so that they can make wise decisions about how different energy sources fit in their community. To facilitate those activities through EGLE, there's a couple of different activities that we've done. One is to effectively curate a bunch of resources, because there are a bunch of resources out on the internet, to help communities think through planning and zoning for clean energy. And so you can see there's a link to the EGLE's website where you can download a bunch of these resources. And we've also been putting together a bunch of webinars on clean energy. We did this last summer and fall through the Michigan Association of Planning and Michigan Townships Association. But in the last month or two, we've been putting together webinars as part of EGLE's Clean Energy Management webinar series. And so as this is effectively kind of a continuation of that, we gave a webinar about a month ago on planning and zoning for utility scale wind energy. And this one is most of that same content, but specifically tailored to the Western UP, because I understand that this is an issue of discussion here. I want to acknowledge and introduce to you Sarah Lee, who has been helping me. She's Graham's Clean Energy Engagement Specialist. She's organized these webinars, and you'll likely see follow-up from her on these slides. I want to let you know that this is being recorded. We will have both the recording and the slides themselves, which includes the links, available later on this week. The overview for tonight is, first, I'll start out by talking about why there's so much activity around wind energy. And then my focus for the next 15, 20 minutes or so will really be on what you should know about wind energy's local impacts. So a lot of this is drawn from some of the work that I've done in the state, but also kind of pulling together work from other researchers to really help you understand the local pros and cons of wind energy. And then Brad Newman is also on the line, and I'll be turning it then over to him to talk about the basic principles that local governments have in their quiver to be able to regulate wind energy. Our goal is to have our presentations totally last no more than 45 minutes. I'm saying that out loud to keep myself on target in talking to you, so that we can then have lots of time for questions and answers. So throughout the webinar, As questions come to you, please use the Q&A function that is in the Zoom console. You'll be able to type questions into us. We'll be taking them and organizing them, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. I can also tell you, I'll share with you my contact information. You can feel free to reach out to me after this webinar if any questions come to you, and I'm pretty sure that Brad will do the same, offer the same up for you. Okay, so the first section of this is, why are we talking about wind energy? Why is there so much attention? Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that wind turbines come in multiple scales. And tonight, I really want to talk to you about the big wind turbines. I often refer to them as utility scale. These are the ones that tend to be 500, 600 feet tall. Usually they're in groups, grouped together in wind farms. And they effectively are clean energy power plants. But there are also smaller wind turbines that are under 100 feet tall usually, and they're used to offset power at a single residence. Sometimes, depending on the utilities policy, that power can be sold back to the grid, but those are kind of personal scale wind turbines. And tonight we'll really focus on the large turbines. Right now in the state of Michigan, there are about 1,400 wind turbines totaling about 2,200 megawatts. And you can see on this map that they're spread across the state, clustered kind of in the thumb and through the middle of the Lower Peninsula, but you may be familiar with the wind farm that is up in the Garden Peninsula in the UP. And I should note that in my research, that is one of the places that my data is drawn from. But that's not the only wind that, in addition to those, 2,000 megawatts or so that are currently built, there's about just as many that wind developers are studying whether or not there's space on the grid. So this map is taken from something called the MISO-Q. That's the transmission grid, and developers who are interested in building wind farms need to apply to the grid to see if there's space effectively for their power plant to hook on. So you can see that in addition to the project that is in the queue from the Western UP, there are also other projects across the state in slightly different locations. These ones in particular down here are different than where there are currently wind turbines already in operation. Question that I often get is, why is there so much activity? Well, some of it is from demand from consumers and cities and corporations who say, we want cleaner energy sources. In the UP in particular, I should say that there's likely to be an increased demand for this, in part because of the review of the UP electricity sector through the UP Energy Task Force that just came out with their kind of recommendations, effectively asking utilities to look into the cost of power and reliability and make plans. And I think clean energy is likely to be an increasing part of the mix, in part because the technology advancements in wind energy is making wind possible statewide and also a lot cheaper than it once was. And so it really is, it's increasingly a cost competitive option. The primary technological advance that's happened in wind energy over time is really this increase in height. So this is kind of showing, the size of turbines that we saw back when some of the first wind turbines were built just south of the Mackinac Bridge in 2001. Most of the turbines in the state are around 490 feet tall, but there are turbines that came online at the end of last year in Isabella County that are 583 feet tall. And that this increasing height allows turbines to, first of all, you can see the size of the rotor diameter, they're capturing more wind, but also they're able to access high winds in higher locations. And the winds are steadier across multiple parts of the state. And so it just means that it's viable to economically produce wind power in more places than it once was with shorter turbines. A question that communities often ask when they've been approached by a wind developer is, why us? So effectively, there are a number of things that wind developers are looking for. One of the key things is access to transmission. I told you that the developers have to do a formal study with the grid operator to see if there's space on the grid for them. But they often want to locate very near an existing transmission line. So that is one indicator. A good wind resource is another indicator, but that's pretty easy to come by. As I mentioned, like much of Michigan is now viable for wind. Another thing that wind developers are thinking about is like, are we getting in a territory where we're going to have problems with endangered species? Because in addition to state and local rules, they also have to comply with federal rules associated with endangered species. And furthermore, they tend to not want to be in urban areas because one of the things that wind needs is access to a lot of open land. A wind turbine itself doesn't take up very much land, but the wind needs an opportunity to recuperate from one turbine to the next. So you can't line them all up really, really close to each other. They need to be spread out so that they're not effectively stealing wind from a neighboring wind turbine. In Michigan, often farmland is a primary place to develop because it's already cleared. However, in other parts of the country, it is not uncommon to see wind turbines in forested areas. And among the reasons that forested areas are viable in Michigan is because there's fewer landowners to deal with. When you're trying to develop a wind project in a farming community, you often need to get a whole bunch of landowners on board, where in many of our forested tracts, often there are fewer landowners. And so that's, even though some trees may need to be removed in order to site wind turbines in a forested area, in some ways, there's fewer transaction costs in dealing with a whole bunch of different property owners getting them all on board. Okay, so that's some kind of background on the lay of the land. And now what I wanted to walk you through are, what are some of the impacts that wind energy has? Before doing that though, actually, I'm not gonna include this slide, sorry. That showed up inadvertently. So I am gonna walk you right through the focus on the local impacts. There are lots of global impacts that we associate with renewable energy, but my sense is when it comes to land use regulation, it's really helpful to think through the local benefits and the local concerns that a wind or solar project might bring, because really that's what's most relevant for you and your community. So I'm going to walk you through the local benefits and then come back to walking you through some of the local concerns that are common. On the benefit side, many of them they're primarily economic. So one of the key benefits of wind development is the landowner payments that a wind developer makes. This is where, actually, this is the heart of some of my PhD research, is trying to understand how landowners use those revenues. And what I found is that because many of the wind projects in Michigan are in farmland, it's farmers receiving the revenue, and they're taking that revenue and reinvesting it in their farm. And so from a farmland preservation perspective, that's really helpful. This is a comparison from that study showing how much investment people with wind turbines on their property are making in a range of aspects of their property, from farm equipment to drainage or irrigation, to outbuildings or their home itself, compared to their neighbors and unpaid neighbors. Neighbors who are in the pool are neighbors who might be paid. Unpaid neighbors are what it says. And then comparing them to people in non-wind farm communities. And there is, as you can see, a big difference. It's not just on the amount of money, but it also follows through in terms of farm succession. that farmers with wind turbines on their property are more likely to have a succession plan in place. So from a farmland preservation perspective, that's a great thing. The other thing, though, that I want to point out is that it's not just farmers necessarily who are paid. Even though most of the wind development in the state has been done in farming communities, many wind developers also pay neighbors who are involved in the project, either because they have collector lines between the turbines running under their ground, or because it's really important that that neighboring property owner doesn't put up a cell tower or a different wind tower with a different company that might interfere with the wind. There's often questions about like whether these are out-of-town people who are benefiting or not, and we have some research on that effectively finds that, you know, whether the revenues stay local depends on the mix of the landowners in your community. And so in communities where there are a lot of out-of-town landowners, there are a lot of out-of-town landowners who receive direct payment from a wind developer. But largely, all things considered, more revenues go to people who are in the community. Again, that's a little, I'm going to say right off the bat that that's going to be a little bit different in this situation, because my understanding is of the kind of the proposals that are on the table for the UP involve, you know, are not kind of spread across. It's first of all not on farmland and not necessarily spread across multiple landowners. But that's just a common thing that is involved in understanding economic impacts of wind energy. The one that is true, regardless of where you are in the state, is associated with the property taxes. So even in, you know, regardless of whether or not people get direct payments, the entire community has an indirect economic benefit because the wind developers pay personal property taxes on the wind turbines. The exact amount that they pay varies from place to place, somewhat because of the value of the wind turbine. So, you know, taller wind turbines are going to have a higher value that they're going to pay taxes on, but also because there are different millage rates from place to place. Some of my work has looked at those property tax rates, and here you can see this is just kind of showing you these boxes are arranged from order of communities with the fewest number of wind turbines, 5 in this case, to those with the largest number of wind turbines. This community here has about 80 turbines, and looking at how the property tax base has changed over time. So in the communities with the smallest turbines, their property tax base went up 16%. In those with lots of turbines, it went up over 400%. Because in many communities, this is the community-wide economic impact, I have a couple more slides that kind of dig more deeply into this, because I think there's a couple of things that are really important to know. First of all, you may have seen on some of the graphs on the previous slide that the revenues are not steady over time. In part, that's because, well, largely that's because wind turbines are taxed as industrial personal property. And so there's this multiplier that assessors apply to the taxable value. And it, you know, they tax it at 100% in year one, but then that steadily declines over time. I should also note that that there's some differences from place to place in terms of which units of government receive this revenue. So a lot of what I've looked at and what I showed you on the previous graph is really about township revenue, but property tax revenues also go to the county. And there's also some money that goes to the state school fund. In communities where the schools have a sinking fund or some kind of debt fund, those schools might also see their tax revenues increase as a result of wind development if there's like opt-in millages. But one of the tricks associated with wind development taxation is that this tax table that's applied here is not something that the local government has control over. This is something that's set by the State Tax Commission. And I'm not gonna hide the fact that this tax table changed 3 times in 4 years. And so it's not necessarily set in stone. And as a result, there were a number of years where there were a number of wind turbines that were caught up in the tax tribunal. Because of kind of this declining revenue stream and also the changes in tax revenue, those community-wide benefits are not always visible to residents. So when I've talked to township supervisors with wind turbines in their community, they'll say this, direct quotes, "This is a great shot in the arm. Like, this has really been good for our fiscal health." But not all of the communities, the township governments, county governments, use those monies towards services that people see. So this is effectively across the places that I've studied, the percentage of community members who said that their township services improved from wind development. Again, a range from the township with few turbines to the township with the most. And clearly something is crazy going on in Township E. And that township introduced trash collection as a result of wind development. And so that tax benefit was very visible in Township E. In the other communities, those tax revenues were used to improve roads, or to, pay off old debt, which is, from a fiscal health government perspective, really, really important, but less visible. And so I think that this is among the reasons that there are economic benefits associated with wind, but they're not always visible to residents. Another economic benefit associated with wind energy are jobs. And there's a whole bunch of talk, especially right now, about clean energy jobs, and that's not hype. I'm not disputing that. But what I think is really important for people to understand is that most of the jobs aren't necessarily long-term in the community that hosts the wind farm. There are a bunch of jobs during construction, and some of those can be filled by local firms in terms of civil works or in the hospitality sector, hosting workers that come in to construct the wind turbines. But once the wind farm is operational, there's typically only a handful of long-term maintenance jobs. Maybe that, just a couple of, or a few jobs is important in some of the communities that host wind turbines, but people should know that generally for the host community, wind development isn't like a huge, huge jobs driver. All right, next I want to just talk quickly through some local concerns of wind energy before I turn it over to Brad. So in terms of concerns, very often people talk about concerns related to noise or other health impacts, in part because a lot of these conversations come up in zoning discussions, and it's zoning's job to help regulate the public health, safety, and general welfare. And so, arguments about noise and health are often salient. Most of the medical research does not find a direct causal link between wind turbine sound or between flicker, which is when the wind turbine blade is between you and the sun, and as it rotates, it creates a shadow, like a strobe effect. There's not a direct link between that sound or the flicker and human health impacts. But there's an increasing amount of research on an indirect link between these things, and it's associated with annoyance. It's that some people tend to be more annoyed when they have turbines nearby, and that annoyance can cause physiological impacts, can have physiological impacts. And so, there's a lot of things that you can do to try to reduce that annoyance. One of them is to have a process where people can be involved in the siting process. That's one of the ways that that you're able to reduce some of that annoyance. Another concern that's often raised is associated with wildlife. Not only during the construction, during any kind of construction, there's going to be wildlife disturbance, but also in the operation period of the wind farm. Most of that concern is associated with birds and bats, and the actual impacts really depend on where the turbines are sited. So the nature organizations like the National Audubon Society have statements that are generally in favor of wind energy when it's appropriately sited. And there's also guidelines from the Fish and Wildlife Service that help local governments help governments do assessments to understand what the impacts will be so that you can figure out if they're mitigated. This is not my area of expertise. I can point you to other studies. I've looked and there's not any specific studies that I've been able to find on wildlife studies associated with this part of the UP. But I know that that often comes up, and usually on farmland, I'm able to say there's, farmland is not typically great habitat for most of the species that we worry about. And that might be, I'm not sure in this particular place, but again, we'll be able to point you to these studies. By far, one of the biggest concerns about wind energy is about the visual impacts. These towers are 500 or 600 feet tall, and so they're really hard to camouflage. Now, inside woods, it might be easier than on flat farm ground. Even so, though, there would certainly be places where you probably would be able to see the wind turbines. And another thing that's really important is that the visual impacts are both during the day and at night. The FAA requires a blinking red light on top of the turbines. There's a technology that allows those turbine lights to be turned off, except when an aircraft comes into the vicinity. But those red lights are ones that that can be seen even farther than what the turbines can be during the day. Sometimes these concerns over visual impacts spill over into concerns about property values. The most authoritative study on this, which includes the most data from the US, doesn't find an impact on nearby property values. But there is some mixed evidence from other countries, and there is no specific study of wind turbine impacts on property values in Michigan. Linked to kind of one of the papers, the property value studies papers, and something that I think is really important that I hear again and again, and this is again from some of my own research, is whether people see wind turbines as a net positive for their community or a net negative is really this last bullet. It's about whether or not this wind farm fits into why they live in that particular place. When people have moved to a place for the view, they are more likely to be concerned about wind turbines because, again, it's really hard to camouflage a turbine. For those that are in a rural community, more for its productive properties, because this is a landscape where you farm or where you log or where you mine. Wind energy is often seen as just another way for that land to be productive. So the title of this paper, Farmers versus Lakers, is something that often comes up in Michigan, and it's a little bit different, I think, in the Western UP. All right, so my bottom line that I tell communities, and again, I'll be honest, that most of the communities that I talk to across Michigan about wind energy are more in agricultural communities, because that's where many of our wind farms already are and are proposed, is that wind energy is really an economic development proposition for a community, and perhaps one of the biggest economic opportunities that rural communities have seen in a while. I generally tend to tell them that if your goal is to sustain agriculture or a productive landscape that wind can fit in, this is another way for property owners to have that land be profitable and to contribute to the tax base of the community. If your goal is for substantial residential development or growth of tourism, wind is a harder sell because it does change the view of your landscape. And so if the potential home builders or tourists are drawn to your community because of its view, that is very likely to change. That's all the slides that I have, and I'm happy to turn it over to Brad Newman at Michigan State Extension. Brad and I have worked together on a number of projects, and it's great to have him here tonight.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. Welcome, folks, and thanks for having me. My job here is to follow Sarah and to talk just a little bit about different regulatory approaches with respect to wind energy systems, and really to have that be a Michigan-specific conversation. I am with Michigan State University Extension, and I am based in Marquette County. I'm a senior extension educator. I am a planner by background. I've got about 16 years working in local government in the community setting with planning, zoning, community development, economic development, and natural resource related topics. And since I guess wind energy began to be developed in Michigan, MSU and the Extension Service have been doing outreach and education with local government on this topic to help them understand really the roles, responsibility, authorities that local government has in Michigan to regulate energy. Certainly, we are in a transitional time where we're moving from energy sources that historically have been concentrated, larger, singular generators of electricity, like a coal-fired power plant, to an environment where we see more distributed sources of energy generation. And so more and more communities are finding the need to address this topic. And what we hope to do is give them some basic information to be able to do it in a legally defensible way. Although with that in mind, I do want to say that the information that I want to share is really, it's for educational purposes here. It's not to be taken as legal advice. I am not an attorney, and I do strongly encourage any unit of government working in this space to work with a municipal attorney. Not all attorneys are created equal, and a municipal attorney that is highly experienced in planning and zoning law or land use law, because Michigan does have quite a bit of case law in this area. And we know that case law can be instructive beyond that the enabling statutes provide in terms of authorities and powers. So let's get to that point. I want to start my conversation off by having participants really think about our legal framework. This is maybe a civics slide here, that, as a group of states, right, we live in a world of shared sovereignty with the federal government. And so both the states and the feds have, of course, a constitutional basis to the laws in those respective jurisdictions in that dual sovereignty model. So we can really think of kind of a hierarchy of authorities or rules, if you will, that, at the top would be the constitutional framework that principally provides local government power, but also provides protections to individual citizens in terms of liberties and protections of certain rights. So constitutions are supreme. Below that, then, of course, we would have our laws. The federal government passes laws that impact all of us, of course, in our daily lives. The federal government passes laws that preempt or limit what local government can do. But in our country, the federal government has delegated an awful lot to the states in terms of regulation of health, safety, and welfare, right? That the states really have that kind of an authority. We can think of the pandemic right now and what the CDC can recommend, but cannot regulate, right? That's where the state comes in to actually pass those executive orders or those kinds of legal decisions. So the feds regulate, but in a lot of ways for the things that we generally experience as citizens, it's our state that is setting some of this framework. And so, the constitutions really speak to that state government framework, that dual sovereignty. And it's said that local government is a creature of the state. I'm sure you've heard that. And so, then the states can delegate, of course, to local government through enabling acts or enabling laws, certain powers to regulate and address various health, safety, and welfare impacts. Within that whole framework, then we have our court system, which will, of course, receive a challenge from a individual citizen or a business. And in some cases, it's the local government that's bringing a challenge. And then the courts, of course, add some additional detail. They'll interpret, in some cases, what state law says, what local law says, and give additional guidance in terms of that legal framework. So those court cases, when they are published, they are binding. They must be interpreted the way the courts have spelled out in the opinion, and future court cases must follow that lead. Oftentimes we see unpublished court cases. Those aren't necessarily legally binding, but oftentimes when a court decides not to publish a case, it's doing so because they're not introducing any new law. In that judge or that court's opinion, they aren't establishing new law. This is something that's been previously established, that's well understood, and so it doesn't have to be published. But still, those unpublished cases are, insightful and good to look at and be familiar with. Okay, so delegation of authority comes from the top down in this case, and so local government sees those enabling acts and then has power to regulate things locally. When we think about wanting to regulate a certain aspect or an activity in our communities, any local government really should first start and identify a source of authority to regulate something. In other words, as I said before, we need to find an enabling act. For townships in Michigan, we've got two really significant parent authorities or enabling acts. One of those is what's called the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. One of those is the Township Ordinances Act. Cities and villages have similar enabling statutes. A charter city would have another kind of parent enabling authority in addition to the Zoning Enabling Act, which is really a universal enabling act across all types of local government. You see it's got a fairly recent date. That's because, a decade or so ago, 3 former statutes were consolidated. Previously, we had separate authority for townships, separate authority for cities and villages, and a separate zoning authority for counties. They've all been consolidated now. So that power is not new as of 2006. Local government has been adopting zoning ordinances in Michigan since the 19 teens and 20s. So it's important to further distinguish between zoning and what might be adopted under the Township Ordinances Act. We'll often say that local government does have police power. Police power is a general term to refer to local government's ability to regulate something in the interest of health, safety, and welfare. Now, we often will say that a standalone or a separate police power ordinance is different than a zoning ordinance, because with zoning, we're dealing with the regulation of land use or private property. And here in our country and in Michigan in particular, we have extra protections in our Enabling Act in terms of private property rights and the limits of what zoning can do. Particularly, we see that with the ability of a property owner to continue an activity on their property that was established, say, before zoning even existed. The activity can be grandfathered in, or we would call that a non-conforming activity. So let me just wrap it up by saying that with zoning, we sort of think of that type of an ordinance being a little bit different because of extra protections on private property. So we do know that zoning has been interpreted to be a regulation of the long-term use of land and structures by the characteristics of that use and location, or the siting of those different uses, whereas general police power ordinances have been interpreted to be ordinances that govern activities on the land, still affecting the general health, safety, and welfare, but somewhat different. And so we have some case law here that has spoken to this. And the courts have said that the use of land and activities on the land cannot always be mutually exclusive or absolute. So the courts acknowledged there is some overlap or some messiness in trying to distinguish, well, is this a land use or is this an activity? But I do want to point out here and go a little bit into depth about what we have been able to see the courts writing on this topic. And here's a case from the early 90s where the court ruled a zoning ordinance is one that regulates the use of land and buildings according to districts, locations, or areas. Okay, so we often will hear of zoning districts within a jurisdiction where you can carry out certain types of activities by right in one district, but in a different district, that activity might take special approval or might not be permissible at all. You could think of a residential neighborhood as compared to a commercial district, maybe along a highway corridor. In this same case, the court wrote, the question whether or not a particular ordinance is a zoning ordinance may be determined by a consideration of the substance of its provisions and terms and its relation to the general plan of zoning. Ultimately, in this case, the court found that the police power ordinance adopted by the township was really regulating land use, and thus it was found to be invalid. I want to tell a short story about a wind energy regulation case from about 10 years ago, more than that. This is really the early days of wind energy development in Michigan. So I say it's a tale of three townships as opposed to two cities. In April of 2010, Clinton County, who was the zoning authority at the time, passed a wind energy amendment to the county zoning ordinance. In other words, the county zoning ordinance was silent on wind. Planning Commission and the county board saw the need to adopt standards that did apply to wind, and so the ordinance was amended with those standards. Well, prior to the county issuing a permit, and the developer in this case is Forest Hill, okay? Prior to the issuance of a permit, but after Forest Hill had applied for their zoning application, three townships that were subject to county zoning each adopted a separate police power wind energy ordinance. And in those ordinances had the effect of essentially prohibiting Forest Hill's proposal due to the height standards that they adopted, the setback standards, noise, and shadow flicker. So what Forest Hill was applying for in the plan that they presented would not be permissible based on the township police power ordinances, yet the proposal satisfied for the most part the county zoning ordinance. Forest Hill filed a lawsuit claiming that the township police power ordinance prohibited wind in the townships, and they requested that the ordinances be found invalid and said that, hey, there's county zoning in effect. These ordinances should be preempted by the county wind energy ordinance, wind energy zoning ordinance in this case. So the trial court found that the township's ordinances were zoning ordinances. That's according to the circuit court. Yes, we think these are actually zoning ordinances, and that they were unenforceable because the ordinances were adopted under the Township Ordinances Act. That's that other police power enabling act I mentioned, instead of being properly, in the court's opinion, adopted under the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act, where ordinances regulating land are required to find their basis. And the Court of Appeals agreed with the trial court's finding that these ordinances essentially constituted zoning ordinances. And because they weren't enacted under the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act, the county zoning ordinance was controlling. So essentially the Court of Appeals here was affirming what the trial court found. The Court of Appeals wrote in this case, it's clear that the ordinances regulate the use of land. The construction of an infrastructure of wind turbines as part of a wind energy system is not merely an activity on the land, but rather relates to a permanent land use. The applicable section in the Zoning Enabling Act, Section 201 that the court referred to, the court believes that it's clear in the Enabling Act that this particular Section 201 supports the trial court's determination that these ordinances were in fact should be treated as zoning ordinances, but again, weren't adopted under that parent authority. While the Township Ordinances Act permits defendants, here in this case, the 3 townships, to adopt laws for the protection of health, safety, and welfare, a zoning regulation must be enacted because these ordinances, in effect, regulate the use of land and not just isolated activities. Therefore, the ordinances are not proper regulatory laws enacted pursuant to the township's general police powers. So that's an unpublished case, but it does go along with or refers to a published case, that Natural Aggregates case and the Square Lake Condo Association case. So we might believe that the Forest Hill Energy case was not saying anything new, even though it was an unpublished case. So something to think about. I know the township is considering what I would call a police power ordinance related to wind energy. So instead of the Township Ordinances Act, it seems the authority to regulate wind energy really must be found, and is really only found, in the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. And the state legislature grants all local governments the power to regulate land use in the MZEA. And zoning is adopted for various local purposes. Any community that gets into it will have their own list of reasons for doing so. Those vary from community to community. And it needs to be adopted not for a single land use, but zoning shall be adopted that addresses all land uses that are legal land uses where there's a demonstrated need. So that's a pretty tall task for a small community, but one thing that the statute does put in place is the need for a community to create a plan. In other words, a zoning ordinance shall be based upon a plan designed to promote health, safety, and welfare. And so where the Zoning Enabling Act gives us that zoning authority, we also see that the state has given local government a separate planning authority. And we see that really planning should be done first, with the community working hand in hand with local government officials to really come up with this overall community-wide plan for the development of physical infrastructure and land use within the community. And so with a plan in place, then we would adopt a set of zoning regulations that really implement that plan. And so this plan really becomes this official statement of the community's goals, of its objectives, of its policies for the future, as we can see here with the example image from Ironwood, a postcard from the future. How does the community envision itself in the future? That's our blueprint or our roadmap. And we're going to get our community there in part by having land use regulation in the form of a zoning ordinance to protect those landscapes that we cherish, or to see growth and development along a corridor or at a key intersection where there's the services and infrastructure to accommodate, et cetera, et cetera. So just real quick, we see then that zoning is the establishment of development regulations that specify land uses allowed in specific standards, minimum parcel sizes. It specifies building locations and spacing. And this is typically done by dividing the community up into different districts or zones that are then shown on a zoning map. And so really what we have is a overall document that has written standards, and those standards being applied to the landscape vis-a-vis a zoning map that specifies where certain things are most appropriate based on that planning framework, based on all of the engagement of the community before zoning regulations were written. So that's a real crash course in planning and zoning authority. We have much more that we could share. MSU Extension has a program that has been around for more than 20 years now called the Citizen Planner Program that helps local government understand their roles, responsibilities, and best practices related to planning and zoning. And I don't pretend to substitute the last 15 minutes for that important, impactful program. But if we can use that as kind of a basis for moving forward, we can see that maybe we've got only a few options for how we might regulate wind energy. Certainly there are unzoned communities in Michigan, and there are a couple of townships where utility scale wind energy has been developed as part of a broader project in unzoned, unregulated townships. For the most part, though, wind energy in Michigan to date has been sited and developed in jurisdictions with zoning authority. The vast majority of projects or turbines are in jurisdictions with zoning. A second option, which I've got negated here because as a non-attorney, I'm not comfortable with this option, given some of the case law we've read, that maybe you could regulate certain aspects or impacts associated with wind. And I'm going to get to a couple of those here in just a minute. But I think that authority is very limited. Maybe we can regulate, noise as one example. But with a police power ordinance, I really don't think we've got an ability to say where these things can be cited, or to go too much into other facets of impacts. More on that here in a moment. I think a third option then is a full-fledged zoning ordinance that not only has standards for wind energy systems, but also has a plan and standards for other types of land uses, right? Our residential, our commercial, our industrial, our more productive uses of the land. I say productive in terms of forestry and mining and wind, right? More of these rural productive types of uses as well. So Sarah, I think, has alluded to this document. Myself and a colleague and a former colleague have provided and with Sarah's help, actually, Sarah was a big help in the last update to this, sample zoning for wind energy systems. This is a large resource that does exist for communities that might be considering zoning regulations with respect to wind. Let's, for the sake of, I guess, just talking this through a bit more though, think about some of the typical standards that we see for utility scale wind energy. We will see standards like these and more, but setbacks, sound, shadow flicker, lighting, avian and wildlife impacts, protocols for decommissioning, other safety standards regarding the construction code, and necessary permits with MISO and all the other state or federal agencies. And we think about these. I think there might just be a couple of these that maybe could be regulated through a police power ordinance. Again, that standalone separate ordinance that is adopted under the Township Ordinances Act. Sound is one of those. Lots of communities have separate noise ordinances. Perhaps lighting is another, but again, I'm uncertain on that given my non-legal experience here. Let's talk about sound though. So the Township Board, as we know from the Township Ordinances Act, may adopt ordinances regulating health, safety, and welfare. If we see something that's threatening health, safety, and welfare, local government generally can adopt a regulation for that issue. So if we're concerned about noise associated with wind energy, we probably could adopt an overall noise ordinance for the jurisdiction. However, that noise ordinance would apply to everything. We would be regulating noise, whether the activity is a turning turbine, whether it's a logging truck, whether it's a house party, whether it's a bar or a restaurant establishment. So this is something that many communities have. They'll have a sound or a noise ordinance, but it is something that has to be regulated and enforced. When regulating noise, court cases provide important lessons and sort of cautionary notes. And one of the more recent lessons is that the reasonable person standard that has been in place in Michigan for some time, as it's applied to noise regulation, these days it's less valid. Maybe to some they would say it's even been struck by a more recent case in 2016. This case in 2016, we have seen the Court of Appeals say that an ordinance needs explicit standards. So instead of a general reference to a reasonable person would find this noise objectionable, or that it destroys peace and tranquility, we can't have a standard like that. Instead, we have to have explicit standards. In other words, we need to have a stated decibel level beyond which we're considering this noise or sound a violation. And that's because the reasonable person standard allows too much discretion on the part of a complainant or an enforcement officer, right? And as the example article at the bottom of the slide suggests, this is an article I wrote when this case came out. The courts do not like subjective standards. And the court's opinion on subjectivity in a regulatory framework is, as I say, something that stinks. So cautionary notes with noise regulation, probably could do it. We probably have to regulate all kinds of activities though throughout the jurisdiction. Real quick, what about something like lighting? Sarah mentioned lighting as an impact. You know, we have more communities interested in lighting as it being a nuisance, right? We've got dark sky parks. I think we have 2 or 3 of them in Michigan, and it's not untypical for communities to have lighting regulations. But the vast majority of lighting regulations, the looking that I've done, those are found in zoning ordinances. In a zoning ordinance, not a standalone police power ordinance. I think you still could do it, but again, we would be adopting lighting standards for all kinds of activities. You know, need to consult with an attorney on this for sure. But some of the, as I say, anecdotal evidence, even the International Dark Sky Association presents a model lighting ordinance, yet it's completely based on zoning districts. In other words, it creates these different lighting zones for different lighting types depending on the land use of the jurisdiction. So maybe this is just another example of a type of activity that we might be able to regulate with the Township Ordinance Act, but again, we're not creating comprehensive land use type of regulations with this type of ordinance. It's one activity applying across the entire jurisdiction. And I am a little over time myself. So that takes me to the end of my comments. Again, not comments of an attorney, but comments from a person working in planning and zoning for many years here in Michigan. And I would be happy to take some questions with Sarah here in just a moment. Sarah?
Actually get 2 Sarahs for the price of 1 here. Brad and 2 Sarahs. Thanks, Brad. Thank you so much. It's great to have your expertise here on the like nuts and bolts of planning and zoning and the kind of UP local connection as well. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody. And we do have some questions coming into the Q&A feature. But I do want to take this opportunity to remind everyone listening in that if you have a question that you would like to submit, please do so. I think near the bottom of your screen is the Q&A button. It's like 2 little speech bubbles. And anything you submit there will only be visible to us, the organizers, and we will get to as many as we can. So to start things off, can either of you speak more about the potential health risks of wind turbines?
I kind of whet people's appetites towards that. If you Google wind turbine syndrome, you're going to come up with a bunch of things. Again, the medical research hasn't found a direct causal link, but there is ongoing research on this indirect effect associated with annoyance. It's not necessarily related. The studies, World Health Organization recommendations from Europe have set a noise threshold at which point, a percentage of people are highly annoyed. And so some of it's related to a noise level, but it's not necessarily consistent. And there's, again, ongoing research factoring in lots of different things, not just can you hear the turbines, but can you see them? This is one that the scientists are still trying to untangle. Brad, is there anything that you wanted to add on that? I mean, because I think that there's another element of this, which is safety in terms of like that sometimes comes in.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Sarah said. And I've looked at a lot of the research as well. And as she stated, no direct effects, indirect from stress or annoyance, I guess similar to other stresses that we might have in our life that then manifest themselves with, whatever the medical condition might be. But the research over many years, right? I mean, we've 30 years in the US and longer in Europe. There just isn't direct causal evidence as we see in here these allegations. But as Sarah has mentioned, noise beyond a certain threshold, maybe that is more annoying to us. And so what is kind of that appropriate threshold by which the majority of the population would be in that, less than annoyed category? And so that's where I think we can have a more productive conversation.
Excellent, thank you. Can you also talk a little more about the ADLS technology that turns those blinking lights off at the top of the turbines, and does it work everywhere?
You want to take that one, or you want me to take it?
Yeah, go ahead. I don't have any direct experience with it. From what I've read, it works well. I think we now have it in Michigan. So
that's what I was told, that the first wind farm in Michigan where this has been deployed is middle of the state, Isabella, Gratiot County. I can't remember which one, might be kind of on the border. In terms of how it works, there's been some studies about like what percentage of the time those lights are off, and it really depends on how much air traffic there is in your area. So in terms of does it work, that's one element to come into play. But the other really important thing is that it's the FAA who has to decide. Like, you can't just say as a developer, like, I want this. You have to apply to the FAA, and the FAA will determine whether or not this is the technology that you're enabled to deploy. So you don't have to ask the FAA for it. So for communities where this is a really big deal, I say, like, encourage the developer to ask for it. But if they are told no, like, you can't tie their hands, because this is something that the FAA regulates.
Makes sense. We just had a new question come in. When driving by wind farms, full disclosure, mostly in California, one sees a lot of idle wind turbines, even on windy days. Why do we need to build more when there are a lot of idle ones?
So I've heard the same thing from people driving up 127. Like, why aren't those turbines turning all of the time? There's a couple of reasons for that. Sometimes there's enough power on the grid, or the grid is congested, and so they're called curtailed when they're actually purposely turned off. And so actually, we don't see this. Like, it's very visible when a wind turbine is generating power and sending it to the grid, but we don't know how often our other power plants are turned on and off to respond to how much power the grid actually needs. So I think that, like, this is one of the consequences of wind being so visible on the landscape, is that you can really tell when it's pushing that power into the grid. Some of the projects in California, I mean, they may be beyond their life, and that actually brings up something that wasn't in this question, but I'm going to go there a little bit, which is about decommissioning. Oftentimes this is within a landowner's agreement between the wind developer and the landowner, that, like, the turbine's going to be taken down at the end of its life. Many times within a zoning ordinance, again, most of my experience is in places with zoning, there's a further kind of coverage that the local government asks for, which is decommission, like, is a requirement, requiring decommissioning, both for the developer to come up with a plan and say what's going to happen at the end of that wind farm's life, but sometimes also to provide a financial guarantee to make sure that those wind turbines get taken down at the end of their life. So not quite clear, like, the California experience is just because they're old wind turbines, or if it is curtailment because, you know, the grid's full at that time and they're not needed. All of this idea about how often turbines will be turned on and off, and a recognition that the wind does not always blow, is built into all of the financial decisions that the utility company and that the wind developer is making. Oftentimes they do wind testing ahead of time to know, you know, when it's windy in your neck of the woods, and how that matches up to power demand, and how often, you know, the wind is going to be windy enough to be financially viable to turn the turbine, or too windy and you might have to curtail it because it's too windy. So
the other thing I would add is that there might be some mitigation going on too. One of the potential impacts being shadow flicker, as Sarah mentioned. You know, shadow flicker is something that can be easily modeled and predicted. You know, the technology for that is been very effective. And so some turbines might be turned off at certain times of day in order to mitigate a shadow on an occupied structure. And so that could also be in play. There's one project I know of in Mason County where they actually have installed shadow flicker detection systems. And so the whole wind farm or the whole project has this type of technology. And so where there is flicker experienced on certain occupied dwellings, in that case, the regulatory framework that was established basically said, no, we're not going to have flicker on an occupied dwelling. And so these things need to be turned off at certain times of day, certain times of year. Of course, the sun is moving in the sky, and so it'll vary from location to location or throughout the year, you know, what time of day, or maybe a structure only experiences that flicker for a period of the season, and for the remainder of the year experiences nothing.
Yeah, and just the ability, right, to turn these turbines on and off. It's there's lots of ability to do that, both to respond to kind of market or grid needs, but also to other operational impacts.
Thanks to both of you. And Sarah, thanks for mentioning that bit about decommissioning. That was going to be my follow-up question, so that was perfect. Next question is, let's talk about weather. I'm a weatherhead, but will wind turbines work in our Michigan weather? And wasn't that a problem in Texas not too long ago?
There was a discussion about it being too cold for the wind turbines to operate in Texas, and that's not the primary reason that there were problems in Texas this winter, but it was a contributing factor to that. It is cold enough, or it's not too cold for wind turbines to operate in our weather. Some of it is that people know that if they're developing wind projects in this part of the country, they need cold weather wind turbines. There are wind turbines in much colder places throughout Minnesota, in the Dakotas. It's just, you pay for that. Like the developer brings provides the equipment, matches the equipment to what is needed. And the unprecedented cold snap in Texas meant that those wind farms were just not used to that. And so they couldn't be turned on then for fear that they might not operate.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And I would say, again, there's an existing wind farm that's operational in the UP. So like as a good indicator, it's possible.
That is the banana belt though, Sarah. So
see, this is why it's good to have a Youper here to say hey, the UP is not a monolith.
I do see another question regarding unzoned townships. Talk more about unzoned townships, and I think there's a connection here to weather. So one known impact is if a turbine collects sleet, ice, and that can slough off and drop from blades, and so that's a concern. Obviously, that's one reason we have setbacks in an unzoned community that wouldn't be regulating with setbacks. Probably we would still have a developer that is going to have their own, I guess, industry standard or equipment standard for buffering from those types of impacts, right? I mean, it's typical that a developer is going to make sure that there's at least a tower height up to blade tip, of distance around this turbine where there's not an occupied structure, there's not a gas line, there's not above grade utilities, things like that. So there still would be a setback mentality in mind with that project. These things would still be cited to try to limit lawsuits, frankly, from any potential impact from something like the ice drop from a blade.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Brad was saying. So I mean, most of the townships in Michigan that have wind turbines are zoned because most of the townships in Michigan are zoned. There are two, though, at least, that I know of, and one that I've studied really well. It was one of the 10 townships or 9 townships that I showed in the slides on property taxes. And I interviewed both, I did surveys with a whole bunch of people who live there or own property there, and talked to the township officials and county officials about that. And their ethos there is we don't zone or set rules associated with wind turbines because we don't do that for anything. And it's not like wind turbines were right on top of houses, as Brad mentioned. Operationally, that's not where the wind developer wants to put them either. And so there are examples, and it's not like horror stories of wind turbines in unzoned places. So a lot of this is, and whether we're talking about being unzoned or zoned, I mean, my general MO in a lot of this is consistency. So how do you treating different land, like treating land uses consistently. And their sense was like, it's up to the landowner to decide what they want to do with their property for this and for anything else. And so that's what I heard from them in kind of their story about, deciding like, should we adopt zoning? Because we know that this wind farm is coming.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, how far away from a turbine do you have to get before you can't hear it anymore?
Brad, I feel like once upon a time you had an awesome chart about like sound and distance. Do you have that you can share?
Oh, you muted, Brad.
Yep, let me get that pulled up here. Okay.
Nothing like putting you on the spot. Sorry.
No, I was trying to get there. Now, where's my Zoom controls? Okay. So this was a slide I did have at the ready as Sarah and I were working on this. Now, big cautionary note that each turbine has its own unique sound signature, as you might call it, just like we each have our own unique fingerprint, right? And so this is a Vestas V100 turbine, and this is some years ago now, but for the Lake Winds Energy Park in Mason County, this is what the model predicted sound level was modeled to be at different distances away from the base of the turbine. And so you can see that, out to 1,640 feet, we're below 40 decibels. I'll go to the next slide, which puts this kind of a table maybe into more of a graph or a visual. Now, again, this is a separate turbine. So here we have, what is it, Furlander 2500, and this is a little older as well. Likely of a larger size. This is a 2.5 megawatt turbine. Maybe we're talking slightly taller, slightly more powerful in the case at hand. But you can see again the decibel level on the vertical axis and what the model would be in terms of distance from. And this is the old Michigan, I wouldn't say model ordinance, but previously where there was a 55 decibel reference by the State Energy Office many years ago. But that World Health Organization recommendation that Sarah alluded to, and there's some nuance here. We have to kind of unwrap this a little bit in terms of what this is measuring, where it's being measured, et cetera, et cetera. But that 40-45 area is where a lot of communities end up specifying a noise threshold at an adjoining property or occupied structure. And those are two different points, two different places, by the way. Part of that specificity needed in a sound measurement methodology. Anything else to add on either of these slides, Sarah?
No, I would just point out, because there's a relationship between sound and noise, right? And one of the things that you were talking about earlier, Brad, was about, if you don't want to, typically of course there's a relationship between sound and noise. Setback and sound. Typically the setback's something that like is in zoning territory, so avoid. But even if what you're establishing is a noise relationship, in order to meet it, it's going to be suggesting a setback, right? Like I think that and some of the commentary, if I recall, from like our from the MSU sample zoning ordinance for wind is like, you could almost do one or the other. You don't necessarily have to do both. And noise or sound within zoning can be tricky. Like it's complicated to measure it and enforce it. And but if that's kind of your primary means, of doing an ordinance, then it's going to have with it a built-in kind of setback distance. Is that
Right.
fair?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
So
Thanks for sharing that.
yeah, thank you. Really interesting graphics. That was cool. Switching gears a little bit to offshore. Are there offshore wind farms in Michigan? And if so, what is the applicable regulatory framework for those?
There is no offshore wind development in Michigan at this point. Historically, one of the challenges to offshore wind development in the Great Lakes, as opposed to the ocean, is that it's freshwater and it freezes. So that's been one of the challenges. There is a project under development right now in Ohio off the coast of Cleveland. And the name of it actually is called Icebreaker. So that alludes to the fact, that that's one of the challenges that they're working through. It's been a long time in the making, but it's still, the last I looked, moving forward. And so if there were ever, the bottom lands, the bed of the Great Lakes is held in, I don't know the exact terminology. Maybe Brad, you know it, but it's effectively state control. And so the state would have to figure out, thank you, public trust by the state. So the state would have to figure out how they would go about leasing those lands or lending those lands. And so, but we don't have any offshore wind development in the Michigan portions yet.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I haven't heard any murmurings that this is something that's imminent either.
There was just a big report that came out again. I mean, there's been people that have studied this, but there was again a recent report that came out estimating the potential of offshore wind, and it is huge, but people have talked about it a long time. We haven't seen it manifest yet, and I think that Ohio project has been a long time in the making, and has been met with many hurdles.
Okay. Real quick, I'm going to ask another question. Can we set, and this is switching gears again, can we set height limits on turbines? And what is the recommended way to do that?
Well, a community could take that approach. There are Michigan examples of that. I mean, then the question becomes whether by limiting, the height of a project, the regulation is effectively prohibiting the project, right? Does the standard essentially become exclusionary? If a standard is, say set too low, then the economics aren't there. We know that there's more power in the wind at higher elevation. Certainly that has been a trend in terms of the size of turbines to be more efficient at a higher elevation. The wind is more consistent generally at a higher elevation. So it does have an impact on the economics of a project. I have heard comments, does limiting height mean that you have turbines that are less efficient, therefore you need more of them? Could that be an unintended consequence of some artificially low height standard? The developer still sees the ability to get a project in. Of course, they need to be able to provide a certain number or amount of power, and might have a power purchase agreement that it gets at a certain amount of energy to be delivered. Maybe an unintended consequence is that you get a bigger footprint in the project area, perhaps. So there are, as I said, there are a lot of communities that do set a maximum height. It hasn't been challenged head on in Michigan courts yet, where we have a clear answer that says you can't do this. But I think the other comment I would make is in keeping with sort of that theme of consistency and do we do this with other land uses in our jurisdiction where we set a maximum threshold or size for the project. You know, a maximum size for the Walmart Supercenter. I don't think we typically do that kind of a thing. Some jurisdictions might take that approach here or there, but it's not generally an aspect of how we might regulate a land use.
All right, thank you. Also, I just want to mention, I noticed a hand up, and if anyone has a question or comment, if you could please put that in the Q&A feature, we'll be happy to answer those questions. In the meantime, we do have another question, and that's, can we just ban turbines? You know, is that an option?
Well, Brian, I was going to say, you presented the law on like zoning versus other things, but there's other law on, can you ban it?
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, again, a community is just about free to try whatever they want to try. You know, as a local government, a group of elected officials, we do have a framework, right? Separation of powers, where we do defer to elected officials having, you know, that authority to enact certain regulations. The question is, does that become the prohibition of something where there's a demonstrated need? And so in Michigan, we have, in most states, there's this whole framework of whether a otherwise legitimate land use can be completely prohibited from a jurisdiction. You know, there has been examples of communities doing this with mobile home parks, as an example. And those types of prohibitions have been found to be, you know, exclusionary and not something that a community can do. I don't think we've seen that as a direct approach with a Michigan community to date. Within zoning, if a land use is not mentioned in a zoning ordinance, usually that means you can't do it. But a community, when presented with an application, would have to make a tough decision about, okay, you know, do we hold our ground and find ourselves in court on some kind of an exclusionary challenge, either by a developer or a landowner? I mean, that's the other thing to think about too, is, as Sarah was describing, some of the economic impacts in terms of royalty payments. I think a case we could see at some point in time is not necessarily a developer of a project challenging a case like that, but of a landowner who feels that, you know, there's maybe a civil case here against the unit of government for lost royalties or income from a project. So again, I guess it's an option, and lots of people would be interested in seeing a local government take that approach to see what happens. But from other examples where communities have said, no, we're not here, there hasn't been a real favorable outcome on the part of the local unit.
All right, well, thank you. I'm not seeing any new questions coming in the chat, or excuse me, the Q&A feature. So do either of you have any final remarks or comments? Or it's all been said.
I feel like I just in closing, I mean, I would kind of say that whenever there's something new proposed in a community, there's questions. And I think it's great to ask questions and seek out like what is known. You know, what we've shared is kind of what we know to be the case based on looking at projects in Michigan, based on the impacts in other states, right? Where it might, you know, not exclusively be on farmland, it's in different kinds of landscapes. And so when there are questions, I would say, don't be afraid to ask, you know, again, actually, Brad did a good thing. He put his email address and contact information on his last slide. I didn't. I will chat that out right now. Feel free to contact me, and I can point you to the best available information that we can find, or tell you when something is unknown, where we just don't know kind of what the impact will be.
And I guess a concluding comment I would have is just, yeah, the importance of open communication and engagement. And, kudos to the township for hosting an event like this to try to address those questions that exist. I think it's important, and we have seen research and evidence that engagement goes a long way in terms of the understanding of the project, and generally, the ability to address concerns in the design of a project that is in a proposal stage. So engagement and open communication is an important aspect of this type of a proposal.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Yep. And as we mentioned, we will be taking the recording, right, Sarah? And we'll get it on YouTube, and we'll have the slides available. So feel free to reach out to me or Sarah, and we'll be happy to pass that along to you.
All right, thanks. Have a good night.